Mark, a 25-year-old stuntman, lived life on the edge, literally and figuratively. He performed dangerous stunts for a small drama agency, risking his life for daily wages that barely kept him afloat. With his parents gone, Mark had taken responsibility for his older brother, James, who, despite being elder, relied on him ever since an accident left him physically limited. The weight of their lives rested squarely on Mark's shoulders. The agency paid Mark little for the risks he took, and between rent, groceries, and loan payments, his financial situation was dire. He had taken a loan to cover expenses, thinking his work as a stuntman would help pay it off quickly. But reality hit hard. Despite the high-risk work, the pay was low, and the bills kept piling up. The stress was suffocating. It didn't help that his brother needed constant care and medical attention. At work, Cindy, his 23-year-old teammate, had become one of his closest friends. They spent long days rehearsing stunts and talking during breaks. Cindy was the kind of person who could always make him smile, even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. Her playful attitude and seemingly carefree spirit were the perfect counterbalance to his stress. Little did Mark know, her life had much darker sides hidden beneath that innocence. One night, Mark received a call that shook him to his core. James had been hit by a car. When he arrived at the hospital, he found his brother in the intensive care unit, unconscious, with a severe head injury. The doctor's words were a blur as they told him about the expensive surgery and long-term treatment James needed. The costs were astronomical, far beyond what Mark could ever afford on his current income. Sitting in the hospital waiting room, Mark felt lost. He had no idea how to gather the funds, and the pressure of losing his only family left him terrified. That was when Cindy approached him. She had noticed how distant he had been at work lately and knew about his financial struggles. Without much explanation, she offered him a way out, though it would change his life forever. "Mark, I know you're desperate. There's something I can offer you," Cindy said, her voice lowering to a whisper. "It's not exactly legal, but it's fast money. It'll get you what you need for James." Mark looked at her in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "Cindy, I can't do anything illegal." Cindy's eyes were serious. "Just hear me out. There's a group, a network. They pay well for people like you who can do dangerous things. You're already risking your life every day. This is a one-time thing. It could save James." Mark felt torn. Desperation gnawed at him, and Cindy's words kept echoing in his mind. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he had no other options. Against his better judgment, he agreed to meet her contact. Mark followed Cindy through dimly lit streets, his mind buzzing with doubt. She had told him to meet her after work, and now they were headed toward a part of town he had never ventured into. His nerves were on edge, and Cindy, usually so lighthearted, wore a serious expression as they approached a rundown building. They stopped at an unmarked door where Cindy knocked with a strange rhythm. A man opened it, inspecting them before allowing them inside. The air was thick with tension, and Mark felt a wave of unease. This was a world he didn't belong in. As they walked through dim hallways, Mark wondered what he'd gotten himself into. They were led to a room where a man named Rico sat waiting. Rico's sharp eyes locked onto Mark immediately. "This the guy?" he asked Cindy, his tone casual but firm. Cindy nodded. "Yeah, he can handle it." Rico sized Mark up for a moment before speaking. "We need someone for a job, a test, to see if you're worth keeping around. You in?" Mark hesitated, but thought of his brother. "I'll do what I need to. I need the money." "Good," Rico said, handing him a file. "You're going to kidnap someone. Simple. Bring them here unharmed and the money's yours." Mark's stomach churned. Kidnapping? This was worse than he expected, but before he could protest, Cindy gave him a look. It was too late to back out. "Okay," Mark muttered, the words heavy in his mouth. As they left, Mark glanced at Cindy. "Is this what you do?" he asked, still processing. "I didn't want to bring you into this, Mark," Cindy replied, guilt evident in her voice. "But you needed help." Mark remained silent, his mind racing. He had agreed to do something unthinkable, but it was for James. Now all he could do was hope he'd make it through. Mark spent the next day preparing for the task that now loomed over him. He barely slept, knowing the weight of what he had to do. He went over the details in the file. His target was a businessman, someone with ties to a rival of the criminal network Cindy had introduced him to. The plan seemed simple enough. Grab the man as he left his office late at night and deliver him to Rico's men. The thought of kidnapping someone made Mark sick, but the image of James in that hospital bed kept him focused. He had no choice. This would be his first and last job in this dangerous world. After that, he'd find a way out, no matter the cost. Nightfall arrived, and Mark found himself parked outside the target's office, his nerves eating away at him. He checked his watch. Any moment now, the man would exit, and it would all begin. He tried to calm himself, but his heart pounded louder with each passing second. Finally, the door opened, and the businessman stepped out, unaware of what was about to happen. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he waited for the right moment. His mind raced, questioning if he could really go through with this. But there was no time to second guess. Mark jumped out of the car, quickly approaching the man. He grabbed him from behind, covering his mouth to muffle any noise. The man struggled, but Mark's strength and determination overpowered him. He dragged the businessman to his car, throwing him into the back seat. Mark's heart raced as he drove to the designated drop-off location. His hands were shaking, his mind in turmoil. This wasn't who he was, but he had done it. He had crossed a line he never thought he would. At the location, Rico's men were waiting. They took the businessman without a word, and Mark was left standing in the darkness, feeling a deep sense of guilt wash over him. It was done. The money would come, and James would get his treatment. But at what cost? As he walked away from the scene, Mark felt a heavy weight settle on his chest. He had entered a world he never wanted to be a part of, and now there was no turning back. The money came through just as Cindy had promised. Mark rushed to pay for his brother's treatment, and James was soon on the road to recovery. But as the relief of saving his brother began to sink in, so did the guilt of what he had done. He couldn't shake the image of the terrified businessman being dragged into the shadows. Mark returned to work at the drama agency, trying to resume a sense of normalcy. But things weren't the same. Cindy kept her distance, as if she, too, felt the weight of what they'd done. Mark wanted to talk to her, to make sense of the situation, but she avoided the topic altogether. Days later, Rico contacted him again. This time, the job was worse. Much worse. They wanted him to take out someone from their rival organization, a permanent solution. The request made Mark's blood run cold. He wasn't a killer, and the thought of doing it filled him with dread. Mark refused. He told Cindy the same day. "I'm out. I did what I had to, but I'm not going any further," he said firmly. Cindy's face drained of color. "You don't understand, Mark. You can't just say no to these people. They'll come after us." "I'm not going to do it," Mark repeated, his voice hard. "I'm done." Cindy's eyes filled with panic. "Mark, please, if you refuse, they'll see us both as traitors. They don't forgive. They don't forget. You're putting both of us in danger." But Mark couldn't be swayed. His mind was made up. He walked away from Cindy, not realizing the deadly consequences that were already beginning to unfold. Rico's men didn't take the rejection lightly. Days passed, and the tension around Mark grew. He noticed men watching him, following him as he went about his day. The sense of danger was suffocating. Cindy tried to convince him one last time, but it was no use. Mark wouldn't let himself be drawn further into that world, no matter the cost. And then, without warning, the mafia's decision came down like a hammer. The growing tension around Mark became impossible to ignore. He knew the mafia would retaliate for his refusal to continue working for them, and now the constant surveillance was proof. Every corner he turned, it felt like eyes were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. He kept his head down, trying to distance himself from that world, but the shadow of danger loomed large. Cindy was caught in the middle. She tried to reason with Mark again, desperate to make him see that leaving wasn't as simple as walking away. "They don't forgive, Mark. You need to fix this before it's too late," she pleaded, her voice trembling with worry. Mark shook his head. "I'm not going back. I don't care what they want. I'm done." The tension between them grew, but Cindy's loyalty to the mafia ran deep. She was in too far, tangled in the web of their control, and she knew they were watching her too. Every conversation with Mark felt like walking a tightrope, trying to keep them both safe without drawing further suspicion. Days later, Mark received a message, a chilling warning from Rico. "One last chance," it read. The message was clear: comply or face the consequences. But Mark couldn't do it. His refusal set off a chain of events that would alter both their lives forever. Later that night, as Mark lay awake, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside his apartment. His heart raced, and he moved cautiously toward the window. In the dim light of the street, he saw them, Rico's men, lingering just beyond the shadows. They were waiting, watching. Mark realized he had run out of time. Without wasting another second, he grabbed his phone and called Cindy. "They're here," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "I think they're going to make a move." Cindy's voice was tense on the other end of the line. "I'm coming. Stay inside. Don't do anything rash." Minutes later, Cindy arrived, her face pale and her usual confidence replaced with urgency. "We need to go now," she urged. "If they're watching you, it's only a matter of time before they act. We have to leave the city." Mark hesitated. "And then what? Keep running? They'll find us." Cindy bit her lip, struggling with the decision. "It's better than waiting here to get killed. We'll figure something out, but staying isn't an option." Mark could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't just about him anymore. Cindy was in as much danger as he was, maybe more. The weight of her decision to pull him into this world now sat heavy on her shoulders, and she was determined to find a way out for both of them. But as they prepared to leave, both of them knew the mafia wouldn't let them slip away so easily. No escape. Mark and Cindy hurried through the city streets under the cover of night, trying to stay ahead of the mafia's reach. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat, and they both knew they were being hunted. The thought of leaving the city had seemed like a solution at first, but now the weight of reality was pressing down hard. The mafia's reach extended far beyond the city limits, and escaping was not going to be as easy as they had hoped. As they reached the outskirts of the city, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, dread filling his stomach. It was a message from an unknown number. "You can run, but you can't hide." Cindy saw the message and her face paled. "They're not going to let us go, are they?" she whispered, fear lacing her words. Mark shook his head, grim. "Number, they want to make an example of us." They had thought they could leave, that disappearing would somehow solve everything, but the mafia's grip was stronger than they anticipated. Rico had eyes everywhere, and the more they ran, the tighter the net seemed to close around them. "We need to split up," Mark said suddenly, the weight of the decision heavy in his voice. "It'll be harder for them to track us both if we're not together." Cindy looked at him, panicked. "Number, we stick together. If we split, they'll take us out one by one." Mark clenched his fists, knowing she was right, but also aware that staying together painted a bigger target on their backs. "What do we do, Cindy?" "What's the plan?" Cindy didn't have an answer. The weight of dragging Mark into this mess had been crushing her for days, and now it was spiraling out of control. She had connections, but none strong enough to help them escape Rico's wrath. She was in too deep, and now so was Mark. As the hours passed, they found themselves in a dingy motel on the edge of town, trying to catch their breath. The silence between them was thick with tension. Mark paced the room, anger and frustration boiling inside him. He had never wanted any part of this life, and now he was trapped in it with no way out. Cindy sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted it to end up like this." Mark stopped pacing and looked at her, the anger in his chest subsiding. "It's not your fault, Cindy. You were trying to help." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "But now I've put you in danger. I should have never brought you into this." Before Mark could respond, there was a knock at the door. Both of them froze. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the gun Cindy had given him earlier. Slowly, he approached the door, motioning for Cindy to stay back. The tension was unbearable, the silence deafening. Whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't here to help. Mark held his breath as he pressed his ear against the motel room door. The muffled sound of voices filtered through, sending a chill down his spine. He glanced back at Cindy, who was pale and wide-eyed, her hands trembling. This was it, the moment they had both dreaded. With a deep breath, he gestured for her to stay quiet and slowly opened the door. Peering out, he saw two men standing in the dimly lit hallway, their expressions menacing. They were Rico's men, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They had tracked them down. Before Mark could react, one of the men turned, his gaze locking onto Mark's. He slammed the door shut just as the men lunged forward. "Cindy, we need to fight!" Mark shouted. He could hear the men pounding on the door, demanding entry. Cindy scrambled to her feet, grabbing the gun from Mark's hands. "We can't let them in! We need to hold them off!" With quick reflexes, she pressed her back against the wall, ready for whatever would come next. Mark joined her, bracing himself for the confrontation. They knew they couldn't hold them off forever, but they had to try. The door splintered as the men forced their way in. Mark and Cindy exchanged a quick glance, both understanding what was at stake. They had to fight for their lives. The door burst open and the first man charged in. Mark tackled him to the ground, grappling for control. Meanwhile, Cindy aimed her gun at the second man, who was now entering the room. "Get back!" she shouted, her voice fierce. Mark struggled with the first man, the two of them wrestling on the floor, exchanging blows. The chaos of the moment blurred everything around him. He had never been in a fight like this. This was a life-and-death struggle. Cindy fired a warning shot into the air, causing the second man to hesitate. "I'll shoot! Get out!" she yelled, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. Mark managed to throw the first man off him, scrambling to his feet just as Cindy took aim again. She was strong, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. Mark knew that if they didn't escape now, they might not get another chance. The men seemed undeterred, and Mark's frustration boiled over. He rushed at the second man, tackling him to the ground, grappling for the gun. A struggle ensued, and the gun went off again, this time hitting the wall. Cindy shouted for him, panic evident in her voice. "Mark, watch out!" Before he could react, the first man recovered and lunged at him, tackling him away from the gun. Mark hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. The two men were now focused on him, their intentions clear. In that moment of chaos, Cindy saw her chance. She fired again, this time hitting the first man in the leg. He howled in pain, and Mark seized the moment, scrambling back to his feet. "Let's go!" Mark yelled, pulling Cindy toward the door. They rushed past the injured man and into the hallway, their hearts racing. They had to find a way out before more men showed up. As they dashed down the corridor, Mark's mind raced. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about facing the consequences of their choices. As they reached the stairs, a realization hit Mark. They were in this together, but the road ahead was fraught with danger. He couldn't let Cindy die because of his mistakes. "We need to split up now," he shouted, knowing the danger wasn't over. "No, we stick together," Cindy insisted, fear evident in her eyes. Mark hesitated, torn between protecting her and ensuring their survival. He knew the mafia wouldn't stop until they found them. They raced down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the dark. They had to escape, but time was running out. Mark and Cindy burst through the motel's exit, their hearts pounding as they stepped into the night. The cool air hit their faces like a splash of cold water, but they couldn't pause to catch their breath. They needed a plan, and fast. "Cindy, we can't go back to the apartment. It's too risky," Mark said, scanning the darkened street. "We need to find somewhere safe." Cindy nodded, determination etched on her face. "There's an old warehouse not far from here. We can hide there until we figure out our next move." They hurried down the street, staying close to the shadows, listening for any signs of pursuit. As they reached the warehouse, Mark pushed the door open and they slipped inside. The dim light filtered through the cracks, casting eerie shadows around them. Once inside, Mark leaned against the wall, catching his breath, leaving behind a mix of exhaustion and dread. "What if they find us?" he asked, fear creeping into his voice. "They won't," Cindy replied, her voice firm. "We'll figure this out. We have to." Mark looked at her, admiration swelling in his chest. Cindy had always been the brave one, the one who kept pushing forward even when the situation seemed dire. But now, with their lives hanging by a thread, he felt the weight of her choice pressing heavily on him. Suddenly, the warehouse door creaked open. They both froze, their hearts racing. The light from the outside illuminated a figure, a man, tall and imposing, silhouetted against the glow. Mark's blood ran cold as he recognized the figure. It was Rico. "Thought you could run, huh?" Rico sneered, stepping into the shadows. "You've made a big mistake, kid." Mark's instincts kicked in. "Cindy, get behind me!" he shouted, positioning himself defensively in front of her. Rico chuckled darkly, the sound sending chills down Mark's spine. "You're outnumbered, Mark. My men will be here any second." Mark felt a surge of anger. He had already lost so much. He wasn't going to let them take Cindy too. "You'll have to get through me first," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. Cindy's hand gripped Mark's arm. "We can't let him take us. We need to fight back." Rico took a step closer, pulling out a gun. "You think you're tough? This is the end of the line for both of you." Before Mark could react, he heard footsteps approaching, more of Rico's men. Panic flooded through him, and he realized they were out of time. "Cindy, we need to make a break for it now!" Just as they turned to escape, the warehouse door swung open, revealing several armed men. The room erupted into chaos. Mark instinctively pushed Cindy behind him, ready to fight, but the odds were stacked against them. In the heat of the moment, Cindy took a deep breath, determination shining in her eyes. "Mark, go! I'll hold them off!" "What? No! I won't leave you!" Mark shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. "You have to! You're our only hope!" Cindy pleaded, tears brimming in her eyes. "You can bring them down. You have to finish this." With a heavy heart, Mark realized she was right. If he didn't go now, they both wouldn't make it out alive. "I love you, Cindy!" he shouted, his voice breaking as he turned to run. Cindy moved forward, blocking the entrance. "I'll hold them as long as I can. Just go." Mark hesitated, but the sound of footsteps grew louder. He sprinted toward the exit, the weight of his decision crushing him. As he reached the door, he looked back one last time, seeing Cindy standing her ground against the men, her face a mask of determination. "Don't let them take you!" she yelled, her voice echoing in his mind. Mark stumbled into the night, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't shake the image of Cindy, fighting to protect him, knowing she might not make it out. He had to survive for her. He had to bring justice for what they had done. As he raced away from the warehouse, he felt a surge of determination. He would gather the evidence, expose the mafia, and make them pay for Cindy. The revenge. Mark moved through the alleys with purpose, his heart pounding as he recalled the last moments with Cindy. Her bravery in the face of danger had ignited a fire within him, a relentless drive to bring down the very people who had taken everything from him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for her. In the days following their separation, Mark had meticulously pieced together the evidence against Rico and his criminal network. Using his connections in the stunt community and the underworld, he gathered information, slowly building a case that would expose the mafia's illegal activities. Each new piece of information felt like a step closer to revenge, a way to honor Cindy's sacrifice. He had never wanted this life, but he realized it was the only way forward. The thought of her, her laughter, her strength, fueled his resolve. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. Now it was his turn to be the hero in their story. Mark spent countless hours at the library and coffee shops, poring over police reports and previous cases tied to Rico's operations. He dug deep, unearthing the connections between the mafia, local businesses, and corrupt officials. He knew he needed to go to the police with solid evidence. It was the only way to dismantle the empire that had caused so much suffering. Finally, the day came when Mark felt ready. He gathered the documents, photos, and testimonies he had collected, organizing them into a presentable case. He knew he needed allies, so he reached out to a trusted detective, a man named Detective Roberts. They had crossed paths before during Mark's stunts, and he had always been straightforward about the corruption that plagued the city. Detective Roberts met him in a discreet location, a small diner on the edge of town. Mark's palms were sweaty as he handed over the folder filled with evidence. "Are you sure about this, Mark?" Roberts asked, concern etched across his face. "Going after Rico is dangerous. He has people everywhere." Mark nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "I have to do this. They took Cindy from me and I won't let them get away with it." The detective studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right, I'll take it to the department, but you need to be careful. We'll need to move fast. Rico won't sit idly by while we gather evidence against him." As Mark left the diner, he felt a mix of hope and dread. He was taking a significant risk, but it was worth it if it meant bringing justice to the victims of Rico's operations, including Cindy. Detective Roberts worked tirelessly, coordinating with a special task force to prepare a raid on one of Rico's main locations. Mark was kept in the loop, and while the anticipation was nerve-wracking, he felt a sense of purpose driving him forward. Finally, the day of the raid arrived. Mark stood outside the warehouse where they suspected Rico conducted most of his illegal activities. The sound of sirens pierced the air, echoing the tension building in his chest. He watched as law enforcement arrived, their vehicles filling the street with flashing lights. As the officers moved in, Mark's heart raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for, but it was also terrifying. What if they weren't able to arrest Rico? What if he slipped through their fingers once again? The thought gnawed at him. The raid began with precision, officers storming the building while Mark waited at a safe distance, praying for a swift resolution. Minutes felt like hours, and he could hardly stand still, the anxiety coursing through him. Then came the sound of shouts and the crack of gunfire. Mark's stomach dropped. He had prepared for this, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of the situation. His instincts screamed at him to run toward the chaos, but he knew better. The police were trained for this. He had to trust them. After what felt like an eternity, Detective Roberts emerged from the building, breathing heavily. He spotted Mark and jogged over. "We got him! Rico is in custody." A wave of relief washed over Mark, but it was quickly followed by another wave of grief. What about the others? Did anyone get hurt? 2 officers were injured, but they'll be okay. Rico and his men are being processed now, Roberts said, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "You did good, Mark. Your evidence made this happen." Mark felt a bittersweet smile form. It was for Cindy. I couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. Over the next few weeks, the investigation into Rico's operation unraveled, leading to multiple arrests. The evidence Mark had gathered was crucial in dismantling the network that had been terrorizing the city. As news of the takedown spread, he felt a sense of closure wash over him. But there was still a void in his heart. Cindy's absence was a wound that wouldn't heal. He thought about the plans he and Cindy had made, the dreams they had shared. It felt unfair that she was gone, that he had to carry on without her. Mark vowed to keep her memory alive, to honor her bravery and spirit. He decided to dedicate his life to helping others, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. With his newfound recognition from law enforcement, he was offered a position as a private detective. It was the perfect opportunity to continue fighting against crime in a way that would make Cindy proud. He accepted the offer, ready to embrace this new chapter in his life. Each case he took on would be a reminder of what he had lost and what he was fighting for. He would strive to ensure that no one else would suffer the way Cindy had. As Mark walked home that night, he felt a sense of purpose fill him. The world was still dark, but now he was armed with knowledge, skills, and the determination to make it a better place. He knew that every action he took would echo Cindy's spirit, keeping her alive in his heart. The city may have been dangerous, but now so was he.